Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to really thank the organizers, particularly Daniel Mazixno, who was the first who wrote me, and then my Zattra, and Agnieszka Pindera. We exchanged so many emails in these months that they become sort of friends of mine. So my presentation today, we focus on the first generation and second generation of electronic music studios in Italy. All these studios aimed not only at supporting collaboration between composers, musicians, and technicians, but they also fully opened their activities to national and international networks. I'll give you an example of those exchanges and networks. So among the first generation studios, I consider the Studio of Phonology in Milan of the National Broadcasting Company, RAI, funded in 1955 by Luciano Berio. The first generation saw the birth of the first electronic music experiments in Italy during the 50s and the 60s. The phonology studio was typically an analog studio, which used analog tools such as tapes, oscillators, noise generators, filters, etc. I will show later some of the equipment of the studio. Secondly, the improvisation groups in Rome, particularly the MEV, Musica Elettronica Viva group, which may be considered a transitional phase between the first and the second generation. It began in the spring of 1966, when some American composers living in Rome presented a concert of experimental music in the crypt of St. Paul's American Church. What me and other scholars call the second generation studios is a later experimental phase which started during the second half of the 60s. During that period, studios based their work on analog techniques as well, at least at the beginning. Later on, during the late 60s, some of them approached computer music. Anyway, what makes me and other scholars define those studios as part of the second generation is the fact that they were not based in major cities in Italy. If Rome and Milan were the two metropolis capitals of electronic music during the 50s and the early 60s, the second half of the 60s saw the opening of 3 electronic music studios in Florence, Padua, and Turin, certainly 3 smaller cities in comparison to Rome and Milan. Among the second generation groups, I consider therefore the S2FM Studio di Fonologia Musicale in Florence, founded by Pietro Grossi in 1963, the SMET, the Studio di Musica Elettronica di Torino, funded by Enore Zaffiriego in 1964, and the group NPS, Nuove Proposte Sonore, New Sound Proposals, founded in Padova by Teresę Rampazzi and Ennio Chiggio in 1965. The first generation studios in Italy are considered by scholars as elitist studios because they had the money to afford machines, or they already had the machines and connections, as it is the case of the national radio RAI Studio di Fonologia, who could both produce and diffuse the music on the radio. The model, of course, was the same of the GRM in Paris or the Cologne studio. This interpretation of the historical fact is supported, for example, by a text written by one of the second generation composers, which I will quote. This is a text by Albert Meyer, one of the members of Pietro Grossi's studio in Florence, and he wrote in 2003, "As should be remembered, in the early 60s, so the first generation, electronic music was a very elitist affair. Professional and even semi-professional studio equipment was very expensive, not easy to find, and could only be afforded by institutions such as universities or broadcasting corporations. Access to the hieratic places, beyond the occasional short visit, was rather difficult if you did not belong to one of the contemporary music churches that were influential at the time. This led several composers of the second generation, who were not among the chosen few, to do their own thing. That is to say, in other words, assemble a private studio. In doing so, they usually replaced financial resources with the ability of rummaging through surplus stores of electronic equipment and the cooperation of adventurous and sympathetic technicians. That's what Albert Myers said in 2003. So studios of the second generation were in fact private studios. They were all born at the home of some musicians interested in electronic music. This is the case, for example, of Pietro Grossi in Florence, who was a cello player and teacher at the Conservatory of Music of cello instrument, who decided at a certain point to found an electronic studio at his home. And the same happened with Teresę Rampazzi in Padua, a pianist who, after being at the Darmstadt courses, fell in love with electronic music and decided to try to do electronic music with some friends. Besides Italy, we find, of course, other private studios in Europe. Hermann Scherchen's studio, for example, just to mention one, a studio which, on the other hand, was born well before, in 1954. But it had the same private characteristics, because Scherchen did not feel to be part of the mainstream electronic churches. But let us come back to the main theme of my presentation, the presence of foreign composers in Italy, or, on the other hand, the presence of Italian composers in Europe due to their networks and musical and social relationships. Here you see some pictures from the Studio di Fonology studio in Milan. The Studio di Fonologia della RAI in Milan was an electronic studio designed by Alfredo Lietti in 1955, with the guidance of the musicians Luciano Berio and Bruno Maderna, which remained in use until 1986. Marino Zuccheri was the chief sound technician and music assistant collaborator of composers such as Berio, of course, Maderna, Luigi Nono, Henry Pousseur, and John Cage, among others. Other persons were involved in the recording process, installation, studio wiring, and cabling at the broadcasting company. Luciano Berio, the founder of the studio, drew inspiration from the working methods of American surrealist composer Usaczewski and Liuning at the Columbia University Computer Music Center, or from the GRM in the studio with Pierre Schaeffer, of course. The evolution of the technical equipment, which you can see from the photographs, in the first decade is masterfully presented also in the article, which you cannot see from the, in an article. I don't know why it's not mentioned here. There is a very well-written article in 2012 by an Italian musicologist and engineer which reconstruct all the equipment made at the studio, reconstruct from a philologist point of view, and also led the reconstruction of the studio that is now shown at the Museum of Instruments in Milan, completely shown at the Museum of Instruments. So the first equipment shown on the left is the one that John Cage copied in a drawing of the instruments. John Cage arrived in Milan in late 1959, and the first thing he did was to draw a sketch of the studio to be perfectly at ease with the analog tool. And only after the training, he started to create his Fontana mix. Maybe if we have time, we can listen to a few excerpts later. The studio was renowned for having 9 oscillators, a feature that provided the basis for analog additive synthesis. Each oscillator was designed to operate within a different frequency range. But other machines were made. Alfredo Lietti, the technician and physicist, added a cathode ray tube, for example, which could be used to tune the oscillators in the harmonic relation of sounds. The system was used, for example, by Berio in Mutazioni. Another device was an amplitude selector that reduced background noise disturbances, which was used as a genetic idea for the piece Scambi by Henri Pousseur, who came to Italy as young age to work at a studio. The figure in the middle shows the studio equipment in 1959 and later years. The panel was also augmented with a traspositore di frequenza, frequency transposer. So the figure shows the equipment, and on the right you can see the technical equipment after the renovation in 1968. Here, the oscillators and filters were replaced with wave generators of industrial manufacture, and the panels were rewired. In some cases, vacuum tubes were replaced with transistors. In the next slide, you can see an unpublished document held at the archive of the Studio di Fonologia. This is a letter from Luigi Nono to Marino Zuccheri, the technician. Such letters are very important for research because they allow to understand the atmosphere prevailing at the studio in the first and second decade, and also the influences absorbed by those composers. For example, all the letters exchanged between Luigi Nono, Bruno Maderna, and Marino Zuccheri are all written in Venetian dialect. And these letters were jotted down at the studio after one of them had left, for example, during the evening or the night, and used to leave comments, annotations, reminders, jokes, or simply greetings. In some cases, these letters also contain swear and cursing between the people, just to let you understand the very friendly atmosphere was at the studio. And in this particular case, you can see a letter from Luigi Nono to Zuccheri, undated, but the interesting thing is that, and I'm trying to translate in English, but from Venetian dialect, so which is double translation. So, Sir Marino, and Sior is Venetian for Sir. Marino is the first name of Marino Zuccheri. Vualtri, which is yours. And second line, please make sure that this piece does not last 2 minutes and 25 seconds. And this is important because we can understand that the technician was important in doing the piece, really. And he continues in Venetian, the inspiration of Penderecki strikes me. Or unclear passage, Pollini, the pianist. Instead, it lasts and unclear until the end, etc., etc. So many words are unclear because Luigi Nono wrote in this awful way. But what interests us is that the fact that he mentioned Penderecki pieces. So that's what Luigi Nono wrote to Marino Zuccheri. At the studio, composers did not only compose electronic music or acousmatic music, they also composed mixed music and also radio drama. Many of them won the Prix Italia. Or also music for films and TV programs, and sometimes sound effects for movies, which was, for example, the inspiration for the movie Berberian Sound Studio, which is a movie of 2013, I think. Very, very nice, very beautiful. So the second period, the period of the translation with the Musica Elettronica Viva, or Million Electron Volts, takes form in the spring of 1966, as we have seen when some American composers living in Rome started to promote concerts of experimental music. During the 60s, the city of Rome was, as Frederick Zaretsky observed, I quote, unlike any other place on earth, end of quote. Its artistic community included the Living Theatre, Giacinto Scelsi, Federico Fellini, Michelangelo Antonioni, Don Cherry, Gatto Barbieri, Ornette Coleman, Steve Lacy, or avant-garde dancers and musicians such Trisha Brown, Lamont Young, Marianne Zazela, Terry Riley. So American composer Frederick Reitzvi, along with Alvin Curran and Richard Attebaum, became the nucleus of this improvisation group. The founding of this group was in part a reaction against the academicism of what Curran calls the 12-tone church and the institutions that promoted its music. They emphasized live electronic music rather than music recorded on magnetic tape. For the most part, in its early days, the musicians used inexpensive, unorthodox, homemade electronics rather than elaborate circuitry. Their instruments consisted of found objects, often amplified by contact microphones and a variety of acoustic instruments. In 1967, they introduced a Moog synthesizer, for example. So the members of this group turned their backs on mainstream professional careers. Their activities in the late 60s must also be seen within the broader socio-political context during the rise of the counterculture and the New Left, the urban riots and student activism. In Italy, 1967 was a year proliferated with student protests. And here you see two photos of the MEV with Alan Bryant, Ivan Van Der, Richard Attebaum, Frederick Reitzvi, and Alvin Curran. And another performance this photo is taken in 1969 in Los Angeles. Here you see an example of their concerts, which involved many places in Europe. For example, here they were in Berlin at the Akademie der Künste, and many of these performances are held now in a new edition by the Schachtel label, Italian label, and they produce many concerts by the MEV, which are very interesting. So from a recent presentation of the group, we can read that the MEV was made by 3 young Americans with master's degrees in music composition from Yale and Princeton, meet by chance on the banks of the Tiber River in Rome in 1965. Within a year, they found a musical group whose goal was to turn the clock of music history back to zero, tabula rasa, aiming to walk on air by making music without scores or preordained structures, and, which is important, without conductors or any kind of authority except the human need for unity. And finally, the second generation studios, the Florence studio, the Turin studio, and the Paduan studio, which have, if I try to find some analogies, the one that you see in the slide, a private dimension, we already talked about that, visual arts in the background, or the glue between the pioneers, between the protagonists. Collaboration, anonymity, a co-signing of pieces, different persons with the same purpose, notation and electronic music scores, and an international approach. Here you can see 3 small summaries of the 3 persons. Both, the 3 were all musicians as a background, cello player Pietro Grossiego, pianist Teresę Rampazzi, and a student of composition and piano, Enore Zaffiriego. And they found the studios in the same, almost in the same years, and they exchanged their experiences between each other, which here you see 3 photos. Pietro Grossiego on the left, of course, Ennore Zaffiriego and Teresę Rampazzi below. This aspect is stressed also by their presence in the Répertoire International de Musique Électroacoustique by Hugh Davis. Very important, very important for us book, because it was made in 1967 and it was a repertoire that collected all the studio. He made an absolutely astonishing work in collecting all these experiences. So we can see this, the presence of these studios. For example, here you can see the NPS. So concerning visual arts, which I call the glue, we can say that one of the questions of this today conference is to try to ask the question, why was experimental music promoted by art galleries rather than musical institutions? And I try to ask to this question. I must say that from one hand, I must stress that Pietro Grossi, Enore Zaffiriego, and Teresę Rampazzi did everything they could to make their conservatoires of music open a new course of electronic music. And they were the first to start the electronic music course within the conservatory in Italy. So they made really a big effort to promote within the musical institutions the presence of electronic music. But from another point of view, it is true that they never or rarely gave concerts of electronic music within concert halls. So it is true that art galleries and museums were most interested, maybe, in their music. It is not only a question of interest, but we must say also that many of these people involved in these groups were visual artists, both composers and visual artists. So it is normal that they showed the music in galleries. For example, here you see some events that took place in Italy between 64 and 65, and these events involved all the people we are mentioning here, Pietro Grossi, Teresę Rampazzi, and Enore Zaffiriego. For example, an exposition in Florence, Proposte strutturali, plastiche e sonore, with Germano Selland, with his an art critic, and another with an art critic, Arrigo Laura Tutino, etc., etc., another in Padova, etc. As I was saying, for example, here you see a picture of a score by Enore Zaffiriego, which is very visual. It's not only musical. And they use this score, but also picture, to show what electronic music is from a visual viewpoint in a Paduan exposition with Gruppo N and others groups. So the visual aspects is clear and self-evident. And here you can see, for example, this one is Ennio Chiggio, who at the same time that he founded the Gruppo NPS in Paduan, was also a member of Gruppo N, which was a kinetic group. They made this optical picture and works which were very, very interesting. So they used the psychological studies and on the optical, on the vision, to make artistic works. So if we analyze the network they created in Europe, we can see that they were always interested in opening to international activities, studios, and meet their colleagues whenever they could. For example, Pietro Grossi was in Gand, and I quote, "where I represented Italy," he writes in one of the sources, and Enore Zaffiriego writes in another document, and I'm quoting, "From September 1 to 5, 1964, an international conference devoted to the problems of electronic instruments in music was held again in Gand. Schäfer, Xenakis, Gazelle, Pousser, Koenig, Pietro Grossi for Italy, and others participated." End of quote. But the major event was the one who took place in Florence in 1968. An international convention of the experimental centers of electronic music on the initiative of Pietro Grossi, with speakers from around the world. Beside Grossi, Zaffiriego, Rampazzi, etc., and other composers from the Fonologia Musicale di Milan, there were among the foreigners, and I quote a passage from Enore Zaffiriego writing, I'm quoting, "Fritz Winkel of the Technische Universität in Berlin and Vittorio Consol of the Studio R7 in Rome dealt with topics relating to physics. Leo Kuper of the Studio de Recherche et de Structuration Électronique Auditive in Brussels discussed psychoacoustics and the theory of information applied to auditory perception of music. The theme of sociology and communication was introduced by Abraham Morse. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen of the Vaudier in Cologne described and played two of his compositions. Yanis Xenakis of the University Indiana and at Bloomington dealt with the problems of automatic composition via stochastic or probability theory calculations. A collaborator of Gottfried Michael Koenig of the University of Utrecht presented a paper on the use of computers in composition and in musical experiments carried out in teaching. And there was also the Russian Murzin, which also dealt with the issue of graphics. James Randall, Ivan Statruker of the Experimental Television Studio in Bratislava, etc. But what interests us today, and this is the cover of the event in 1968, what interests us today is the presence of the Warsaw studio, and Enore Zaffiri wrote right after the event. Joseph Pakowski of the Warsaw studio, radio studio, presented the work of a composer from his studio, L. Schoffer, and I'm quite sure that he meant Włosław Schäfer, which is interesting for the graphic layout placed in direct relation to the acoustic outcome. Specific graphic symbols correspond to common electronic sound effects, such as the crackling of white noise, constellations of impulses, etc. In this way, the composer can write his score and send it to the studio for performance. Obviously, the outcome will be approximate, just as the graphic symbol is approximate. That's what Enore Zaffiri wrote right after the 1968 conference. So this was a really international conference, as good as the future International Computer Music Conference, for example, which started in 1976 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and was very involved around technical aspects and problems. Another example of this international character and networks of these Italian groups of the second generation is the presence of the NPS group here in Lodz. Rampazzi, Chiggio, Marega, and Miners were present, or at least Teresę Rampazzi, because sources lack of information. This is the brochure of the event. So Teresę Rampazzi was surely here, maybe Ennio Chiggio, who was the co-founder, but I'm not sure Serenella Marega, Memo Alfonsi, Gianni Miners were here because they were younger. According to an unpublished book, which collects the 7 years of activity of the group, Teresę Rampazzi was invited in November '67 by the Warsaw studio to compose. And I'm not sure if Teresę Rampazzi did really compose pieces. She writes that she was invited to compose, but maybe there was just this concert. And I'm asking you if maybe you have some source of documents held at your archive. On an interesting note, it must be stressed the fact that not only Teresę Rampazzi group made a concert in Warsaw at an exposition here, but Pietro Grossi was also there, at least probably, and wrote this article for the occasion, bilingual, Polish-Italian, where he briefly described the activity of the NPS. So it was not his own group in Florence, but it was the group of his colleagues, Rampazzi, Chiggio, etc. In this article, it discussed several things about electronic music and the story, a brief summary of the group NPS. At the concert, The group present works by members, Teresę Rampazzi, etc. But what you see here is that every piece of music, which, by the way, was called sound objects, and this reminds, of course, Pierre Schaeffer, but they were not concrete music. They were made with analog music. Each of these pieces is unsigned because they believed in anonymity, and they didn't sign their pieces. So this is collaborative creation, really. And finally, another point, I think this is important, but we have already seen some examples in the Polish studio. They attempt at those times to try to find a new way to notate electronic music, which was not traditional music, and offered many problems in the level of notation. So here you can see the score, the typical score they made in Padua with the NPS. So it is more or less similar as Franco Evangelisti, for example, score, but with specific signs that they invented at the Gruppo NPS. So the last theme is anonymity. All these groups, the Pietro Grossi group in Florence and the NPS group in Padua of Teresę Rampazzi and the touring group of Enore Zaffiriego, believed, at least at the beginning of their story, in anonymity. For example, even the choice of the name New Sound Proposers in Padua shows a firm decision to eliminate any artistic inspiration. This was pure research, and each result, named sound object, would have been anonymous. And each time they studied aspects, specific aspects. For example, rhythm here was a sound object that studied rhythm with impulses, etc. There are other pieces, module or masses, for example, or frequency modulation. These were pieces, musical pieces, but not real musical pieces, but sound objects that described and studied some aspects typical of analog music. After a few years, in all these groups, they started to sign their works because everyone wanted to do that in the end. And this caused also some struggling and fight among the members. But this is important for us because this is really a period of counterculture, idea of freedom. And for example, Teresę Rampazzi was involved in a communist cultural association and went to demonstrate alongside workers in factories in 1968. So this was the zeitgeist of the period. And also the idea of collaborative creation mirrored in their workflow, because everybody collaborated in the making of musical pieces within each of this group. There would be so much to say about those groups, but I don't have the time. And just one little thing to say is that, for example, Pietro Grossi group moved later on to computer music, so they started to make music with computers, unlike the group of Teresę Rampazzi, which closed in 1972, and the occasion was that she donated all her equipment to the Conservatory of Music, and he began instead to produce contemporary computer music in the newborn Centro di Fonologia Computazionale in Padova, the first computer music group and center in Padova. But this is another story, and this would be the third generation group in Italy, and I don't have time to discuss that. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much to Laura, Sanna and Agnieszka for their presentations, and also thank you for including me in this survey of European electronic music studios. Obviously, I'm providing a perspective from the UK and focusing on a period similar to that of the other panellists. I'd like to look at the role of the private studio, EMS London, which should not be confused with EMS in Stockholm. It's the same name, but it's a different place altogether. I'd like to look at their role in the initiatives towards trying to build a national studio in the UK, something which actually never actually came to pass, but looking at the desires behind it and the aims for it is actually provides an interesting insight into the electronic music environment of Britain in the 60s and 70s. So, EMS London and electronic music studios in the UK. In April 1966, the composer Tristram Cary published an article in the Musical Times in which he stated that no one seems to notice or care that Britain is rapidly losing another race among so many lost races. However, he continued, it would not be difficult even now to lead the world in an important and fascinating field of study. Cary was exaggerating somewhat, but he's referring to the field of electronic music, which, like a number of other composers in the UK, he practiced in a small studio based in his own home. So throughout the 1960s, Cary advocated for electronic composition to be taken seriously by the new music establishment in the UK, and he believed that the best way in which this aim could be achieved would be if we were to set up a national studio of the kinds that he had seen while travelling in Europe. His article in the Musical Times set out a plan for this studio, which he envisaged as a multidisciplinary institution in which composition could be carried out alongside and in collaboration with research into ultrasonics, instrument design, and other areas. He reiterated this call to a wider audience in an article in the Guardian newspaper in 1968 titled "Why Not a National Sound Laboratory?" So, interesting echo of the discussion this morning about the term laboratory, I think. So, Tristram Cary's vision for a national studio was shared by a number of other composers and inventors and engineers in the UK, including Peter Zinoviev, the founder of EMS London, Electronic Music Studios, whom Cary met in 1967. So they began to work together that year, promoting concerts of electronic music, developing the VCS3 synthesizer, for which EMS would become best known, and establishing EMS London as a company, and also campaigning for a national electronic music studio. So EMS, this is a photo of the studio in the early 1970s. It comprised both a computer-controlled studio for research and composition, which was used by composers such as Harrison Birtwistle and Hans-Werner Henze, and a company producing a range of synthesizers, which were used widely in education and broadcasting and various kinds of music, including pop music. This is one of the small portable synthesizers that they invented. These activities placed EMS at the heart of various developments in electronic music during the 1960s and 70s, yet it was a small privately owned organisation. As you can see, it's based in a house, that's Peter Zinoviev's home in Putney, southwest London. So my paper looks at how EMS came to be involved in an initiative to set up a public national studio in the UK, to go from a private enterprise to something more widely available, and how Tristram Cary and Peter Zinoviev each expressed their aims for this institution, which was never actually realised. But rather than dwelling on the absence of a national studio in the UK, however, I'd like to draw attention to what sprang up instead, namely a network of university-based studios that reflected the diversity of electronic music practice in the UK, as well as the advantages of the low-cost synthesizer technology, which EMS, as a developer and manufacturer, had made possible and made available to these new studios in the 70s. First, though, I think it would be reasonable to ask why the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which is now probably the best-known institution in the history of British electronic music, did not take on the role of a national studio in the way that the Polish Experimental Radio Studio did, in the sense of inviting composers and encouraging compositions to be made there for concert and performance, especially as in so many other European countries, as we've seen, radio and TV stations were home to experimental electronic music studios? Well, with his characteristic bluntness, Tristram Carey had an answer to that question. He also composed for the BBC, so he felt quite strongly about this. In his 1966 article, which I quoted earlier, he says, the Radiophonic Workshop's composers were too busy, he wrote, fulfilling demands from every TV and sound producer who wanted a spooky noise, composing things like the Doctor Who soundtrack, of course. The limitations of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, however, were more deeply rooted and ideological, so I'll just briefly kind of give a sense of that. So as Louis Niebuhr notes in his study of the Radiophonic Workshop Special Sound, from the beginning, the unit was in conflict with the music department at the BBC. So the Radiophonic Workshop was set up in 1958 to serve the drama department, which encouraged the creation of experimental sound to complement the new avant-garde radio plays that they were broadcasting by authors such as Samuel Beckett and Louis MacNeice. And while there's an obvious affinity between this kind of sound work and musique concrète, and there was an interest in musique concrète amongst many of the people that composed for these dramas, the music department did not recognise this, and composers such as Carey saw their work being credited as sound effects rather than music. Niebuhr proposes that in the debate around setting up a radiophonic workshop, which was fiercely opposed by the music department, electronic music came to represent the latest in a series of threats to the BBC's conservative musical agenda that had also opposed developments such as serialism. In one case, there's a quote from one of the music department who worries that setting up an electronic studio would have a damaging effect on the rational aesthetic development of music in the UK. So it's quite, quite deeply felt problem. So by the mid-60s, the music department of the BBC had become much less conservative in its outlook. But the structure of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop remained much the same as a kind of reminder of this conflict. And with the growth of TV, it was now used extensively for science fiction and light entertainment, so there was even less time and fewer resources for composers wishing to make non-functional music. While members of the workshop, such as its director Desmond Briscoe, its founder Daphne Oram, and the composer Delia Derbyshire, who we saw in the picture a few slides ago, were active supporters of electronic music in the UK, these experiments in autonomous electronic music would have to be done elsewhere. So support came instead from an organisation which had been set up following the Second World War to promote new composition in the UK. However, this support took some time to materialise, in part due to this conservative broadcasting environment that I've just described. The Society for the Promotion of New Music, known as SPNM, was set up in 1943 with the aim of getting more new works by UK-based composers performed, and to be included on their list, one had to submit scores to a panel, so the focus was obviously on traditionally notated music. And it wasn't until 1967 that SPNM set up an electronic subcommittee, which was led by the composers Don Banks and Hugh Davis, to consider how best to support and promote electronic music. So as we've seen, electronic composition in the UK was carried out for the most part, apart from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, it was carried out in private studios, such as Tristram Carey's and Peter Zinoviev's. However, 1967 also saw the founding of a studio at the Royal College of Music by Tristram Carey, at Goldsmiths College, University of London by Hugh Davis, and also the universities of York and Manchester had also established studios in 1968, and as Lara mentioned, Hugh Davis had published his catalogue of electronic music studios around the world, thus giving more of an idea of not only what was happening elsewhere, but also the idea that there could be a shared resource within the UK for experimental electronic music. And when the executive committee of SPNM met in 1968 to discuss Davis's and Banks' proposals for a new studio, Carey and Zinoviev were invited to contribute their ideas too. As Nicole Candlish notes in her extensive study of the national studio debate in the UK, this meeting was the first time that Peter Zinoviev proposed that his own studio, which would shortly become known as EMS, it wasn't actually called that at that point, could form the basis of a national institution, which indicates that even at this early stage he was aware of the unsustainable costs of running a private computer-based studio, and that he was keen to see a return on the investment that he'd made in purchasing computer equipment. In 1967, he had installed a PDP-8 computer in his studio at great expense, thus making it the most advanced facility operating in the UK at this time. So while his offer was not immediately accepted, the British Society for Electronic Music was set up by SPNM, lots of initials and acronyms here, to discuss and hopefully implement a national studio for the UK, with Zinoviev as its secretary, Tristram Carey as a member, and the renowned composer Peter Maxwell Davies as a chair. Its principal objective was the founding of a major electronic music studio in London with the intention of providing composers with the opportunities that are available in the leading electronic centres in Europe and America. So what would a national studio in the UK look like? During 1969, Tristram Carey and Peter Zinoviev drafted various ideas for the national studio. Carey built upon his suggestion of a multi-purpose institution which would house not only a working studio with EMS as its basis, but also recording facilities, lecture and concert halls, a library, a store of equipment to be used by touring musicians, accommodation for visiting composers, and a research lab that would be available to those working in science and industry. Although I am unable to locate this in any archives, Carey also stated that the well-known architect Theo Crosby had even drawn up a sketch for the building. It is clear from Carey's proposal that he envisaged the new national studio as an important public-facing institution for the arts. He writes that we envisage a centre where a pop concert, an art show, a ballet, a light sound entertainment, or an opera, part live, part film, and part tape, could all be performed with equal ease. And here we see Carey acknowledging that electronic music belonged not only in the composer-focused, concert-oriented world of SPNM and sort of generally the British classical music establishment of the time, but could exist as part of a wider environment of mixed media art and performance, as well as science and technology. And I think the founding of STIM in the Netherlands, also in 1969, and things that have been mentioned before, such as like the Visions of the Present Festival, which Sanna talked about, shows that this kind of idea could and did actually flourish in other European countries, if not the UK. Meanwhile, Zinoviev, although he was not sure that scientific or industrial researchers should have access to a music studio, he suggested that those working in other media, such as dance or theatre, could make use of it. His reference to the studio as a computer arts studio in one of his proposals indicates that he envisaged it as a space that could accommodate those working in the new field of computer arts as well as music. His proposals were chiefly concerned with the technological realities of establishing such a space in the long term. The principal issue, outlined in his document called Some Thoughts on an Ideal Electronic Music Studio, was that of technological obsolescence. And he wrote, any studio which we talk about is very unlikely to be finished before 3 years or so, by which time any hardware details made now will most definitely be out of date. In Zinoviev's view, a studio needed to be flexible enough to accommodate changes both in technology and in methodology and in ideas, and to serve the requirements of different types of electronic composition. Describing Musis, the hybrid digital analog system that he was at this time setting up at EMS, he noted that it seems to me that in the future, electronics, that is, the electronic devices, will be restricted to digital to analog converters, which will be directly connected to the computer systems. So he's describing a similar system to that which Sanna described that was being made in Stockholm, but obviously on a much smaller scale. He was making this kind of system in his home studio rather than in the much more lavish setting of the Stockholm studio. But the principle is the same. In another document, he developed this further, writing, what I suggest is a small central unit of a fast 8K computer, similar to the PDP-8, which he already had, with a small magnetic storage unit and random access disk file, to which are attached efficient two-way visual display systems and other man-machines connections. The system is then itself interfaced to completely separate units. He then goes on to describe the different kinds of units, i.e. digital to analog, analog to digital converters, and other kinds of devices that would be needed for different kinds of electronic composition for different purposes. So he's already thinking that there are different kinds of electronic music practice happenings, more classical, more performance-led, etc. And he concludes, updating the system would not mean updating the cerebral part, but merely the specialized peripherals. So here he's describing an adaptable, flexible kind of studio that reflects this diversity of musical practices and ideas that come under the heading of electronic music, and that could be easily adopted by different kinds of institutions. And it's my view that the chance to expand this hybrid studio concept, which had already been realised on a small scale at EMS, in the context of a larger and better resourced studio, could have provided an opportunity to test out these claims of adaptability and flexibility, which at this point are just claims, as well as allowing more resources for research into software, which Zinoviev correctly identified as the area in which major future investments in music and music technology would need to be made. So Carey's and Zinoviev's proposals clearly required a great deal more financial resources than a small organisation such as SPNM could contribute. And one of the aims of the British Society for Electronic Music was to seek funding for a studio. Having failed to secure funding from the Arts Council of England, which tends to fund, at this time and also now in some ways, tended to fund individual composers rather than institutions and, these kinds of setting up institutions, Tristram Carey appealed to the audio and electronics industry, writing in 1971, writing an article for Hi-Fi News, in which he cites the Philips support for electronic music in the Netherlands as an example of how this might be done in the UK. In this article, he repeated Zinoviev's offer that EMS should become the basis of a national studio, noting that Zinoviev was no longer talking about selling the studio to the nation, as he had done before, but actually donating it to anyone who could house and run it. Zinoviev, meanwhile, wrote a letter to the Times newspaper making the same offer, co-signed by composers including Harrison Birtwistle. Nobody took him up on the offer. By this time, interest in the idea of one national studio was in fact declining in the UK. The minutes of a September 1971 meeting convened at the Kaluska-Gulbenkian Foundation in London to discuss electronic music in Britain. The Kaluska-Gulbenkian having already funded quite a few new music and electronic music initiatives, it was felt that they might fund this one. But the minutes of this meeting demonstrate how different agendas were developing, which made the purpose and function of a national studio quite hard to define. The attendees included composers, educators, and representatives of the Arts Council and the BBC, as well as Tristram Carey and Peter Zinoviev. While all agreed on the need for more and better national facilities for electronic music, for some this meant stronger regional representation rather than a centralised London institution, and that this was quite a political decision for some people who felt that obviously having a London-centric focus was to the detriment of the North and other regions in the UK. For others, it meant better equipment and opportunities for live electronic performance rather than studios. And the desire for better computing facilities than EMS at this stage could provide was expressed by composers including Jonathan Harvey, who'd had the opportunity to work in computer studios abroad. Once again, however, Zinoviev and Carey proposed EMS as the basis for a national studio, now with the added offer of new EMS equipment. The company's latest model, the Synthi 100, had been designed specifically for studio use, and at the time of the meeting, it had recently been installed at the BBC and also at Radio Belgrade. And although Zinoviev actually considered the synth design and manufacturing work of EMS far less important than the studio's potential for research and composition, it could be argued that it was devices such as this and the other synthesizers that they made, designed by Zinoviev with the engineer David Cockrell, which turned out to have a much more significant impact on electronic music practice in the UK. And these are adverts for some of the smaller synths, which were very much manufactured with the education market in mind. So as universities in the UK began setting up studios throughout the early 1970s, the need for a national studio became to seem even less urgent. The focus shifted to ways in which these regional centres could best fulfil their potential, an idea central to the Electroacoustic Music Association of Great Britain, EMAS, which was founded in 1978 as the British Society for Electronic Music faded into inactivity. The UK had a kind of what you could call an American-style model of university-based studios by this time, and this was described by the composer Simon Emerson in an article in 1975 as a promising, albeit rather tenuous, development. Simon Emerson being one of the funders of EMAS as well, so his concerns were obviously much more regional focused and focused on one studio. And we can see here, just this is an example of some of the studios that were set up during a small period of time in the UK at these different universities. Of course, some of them are in London, but most of them are not. So yeah, this was, as I say, promising, but also had its problems. The size and qualities of the studios varied greatly, and they were all at the mercy of sudden changes in funding or a lack of continuous funding and continuous investment for actual upkeep of the facilities. But they existed, and many of them flourished. And there are some examples, which I don't have time to talk about here, of very interesting practice, particularly at Durham and East Anglia. However, and also, sorry, not so much however, also due to the equipment developed by EMS, which was available at much lower cost than US brands such as Moog, it was basically now possible for numerous universities such as these, as well as smaller institutions such as adult education colleges, kind of community organisations, to purchase basic synthesizers such as the VCS3, which was used a lot as a kind of teaching tool, and in some cases to invest in the larger Synthi 100, around which you could build a much more ambitious studio. In a series of studio reports published by Contact magazine in the mid to late 70s, the equipment housed at each of the UK's various studios is listed, and without exception, each of these studios contains equipment created by EMS. So in conclusion, although the founders of EMS London ultimately failed in developing it into a national studio for electronic music composition and research, by pioneering an affordable British synthesizer range and providing an accessible working example of a computer-controlled studio, we can say that EMS contributed greatly to the wider landscape of studio-based electronic music in the UK. Thanks.